and about health-led, and we understand that it also has to be about dealing with the huge impact, negative impact on families and communities. But I want to make sure that we do deal with the issue of drug crime and specifically drug debt intimidation, that we engage with a sufficient amount of stakeholders on that. I accept we need to look at international best practice. We might even need to look at international solutions. Then we have to be able to move from assembly to report to whatever piece of work is done in the Oireachtas, and then to action as soon as possible.
Just at the outset, just wanted to say that I was very heartened and very encouraged to see the very good turnout at the rally at the weekend. People saying no to racism, people saying that refugees are welcome in Ireland, and the numbers that turned out dwarfed any attendance at any anti-migrant protest that we've seen to date. And I think everyone was encouraged by the numbers of people who are willing to be there. The only two things I would say in addition to that, I really think that any anti-racism campaign, to be as strong as it might be, should be inclusive of everyone, of all parties. Nobody should feel that they're not able to attend or that they're not welcome. We undermine the anti-racism cause by being partisan or being ideological, in my view, and I think it's important that everyone should be included and everyone should feel involved, including the business sector, for example. All political parties, unions, NGOs, we should all be together in saying no to racism. I think that's how we can defend people of colour and their rights and their humanity, is by making sure that any campaign is fully broad and fully inclusive. And I agree with what deputies say about the far right exploiting the problems that the country has. People with extreme ideologies will always do that. Every country has problems. Housing crisis in this country gets blamed on migrants. Other countries, the unemployment crisis that gets blamed on migrants. In countries with high murder rates, crime gets blamed on migrants. And I think it's important that we don't ever mistakenly validate the anger of people who are racist in any way when it comes to these matters. We should try as best we can to divorce racist anger from the very real problems that we face, which we should address. Of course we should, but we shouldn't be so naive to think that people who feel racist thoughts and have racist thoughts and are consumed by racist anger wouldn't just go on to some other issue to blame the refugees about. And I think we all need to be honest about that, because we know it's true. Even go back historically, diseases got blamed on migrants, you name it, weather events. And I think it's naive to think that people who hold those views wouldn't just move on to another issue or the next issue. And I really think the strongest anti-racism movement is one that is non-ideological, non-partisan, and is inclusive of everyone in society. I have to say I'm not aware of the Garda actions that Deputy Barry referred to. I suspect there may be more to it than he describes, but having heard the other side of the story, I can't know that for sure, but I'm sure the Garda Commissioner and GSOC will respond appropriately. Deputy Smith mentioned the whole issue of an all-island labour market. To a certain extent, we have an all-island labour market between Britain and Ireland because of the common travel area, and we have an EU single market, which is the common labour market as well. But I definitely think we should look at ways to enhance it. And in some ways, I'm a little bit surprised that more people don't move north or move from south to north in order to work. Often when we do recruitment campaigns for people to come and work in our public services here, we often look very far afield, and maybe we should actually look north and see if there are people who live in Northern Ireland who might be interested in taking up employment here, or even just gaining experience here. But I think you kind of raised an interesting point that probably needs a bit of thought, and something that we should discuss with the social partners. In relation to the issues in the public service and the healthcare work plan, again, I think it's important to acknowledge in the House that we've never had more people working in our health service than ever before. Never had more people working in our health service since this time 3 years ago. About 6,000 more doctors, nurses, dentists and midwives working in our public health service. It is a struggle to recruit and retain staff, but the fact that we're up 6,000 in 3 years I think is considerable. The HSE, I think last year, had their record year for recruitment, recruited about 15,000 staff. more than any other year in their history. And while I don't think there'd be any problem in having a fully funded workforce plan, I think that sounds like a good idea to me. The real challenge isn't going to be the fully funded element of the plan. It's going to be being able to train enough people, recruit enough people, retain enough people in what is a very dynamic labour market and very much an international labour market. The reason why Irish healthcare workers go to work abroad isn't just because of terms and conditions there, it's because those countries have a huge deficiency as well, and that's why they need to recruit internationally. So it's something that every country is grappling with. On insurance cover, again, would agree with the Deputy. Very sad to see any events having to be cancelled.
Sorry there about the extended waffle there from the Taoiseach. Just waiting on it there to kick into the actual piece about the Citizens' Assembly. Leo the Leak. He's a giant vegetable, isn't he? Or is it other things he leaks? Seeing a bit left. So yeah, we'll see what's actually happening there now soon. Oh, somebody wants to have a bit of noise on the mic. Oh. I paused that.
Adventure parks and so on. So perhaps this is one of the areas where we could help out. Just on the Mother and Baby Institution Redress Scheme, it is a very substantial scheme. It's costs at about €800 million, probably the largest of its nature. And what we've done as a government is to go well beyond what the Commission of Investigation recommended. We've even gone beyond what the Senior Officials Group recommended. And I think that should be recognised. And crucially, there's no requirement for anybody making a claim from the scheme to prove harm or to have to do any of those kind of things that you'd have to do in a court, for example. And I think it's important that the scheme was designed in that way. And the Commission of Investigation did find that many people were culpable for what happened in mother and baby institutions: the church, the state, religious orders, the men who were responsible, and the families who were responsible too. And I think it is significant that the state is stepping up here and accepting its responsibility for its part in that injustice and providing the scheme that it is. Sorry. Yeah, just my apologies, Deputy, just in relation to the 382 deaths among those using homeless services in Dublin in 2018. We need to recall that behind every number there is a person, and we must always remember that with any death of a person experiencing homelessness, that there is a family and loved one who are grieving their loss. And of course, just as the case for people who are not homeless, people who are homeless can die for any number of different reasons. The Residential Tenancies Deferment of Termination Dates of Certain Tenancies Act came into effect. I'm sorry, my apologies. This is about the eviction ban. Deputy, just in relation to the report on the deaths. I'm advised the article is based on information released by the Dublin Regional Housing Executive under FOI, which detailed the number of deaths notified to the DRHE from January 2018 to December 2022 in each of the services they support. It should be noted that DRHE records death notifications from all of its funded residential and outreach services. So these include, for example, people who are in permanent tenancies, who have homes, people who are in housing first tenancies, so they're in supported housing, also people in long-term supported accommodation, and people receiving tenancy support. 43% of the deaths reported were in one of these categories. So therefore, of the 382 reported, 216 were classified as homeless at the time of their death. Of those 216 deaths, not all would have occurred in emergency accommodation. For example, some of the people would have died in hospital or in hospices while receiving treatment for a medical illness.
Moving on to motion, Citizens' Assembly on drug use. You're taking this? Yeah.
So here we go.
I move. Yeah. So, Las Cancorla, across the length and breadth of Ireland, individuals, families and communities are grappling with the harmful impact of illicit drugs use. Directly or indirectly, illicit drugs use affects all of us, no matter what our gender, age or socio-economic background. Whether we live in rural or urban Ireland, no one is immune from the risks or harm caused by illicit drug use. Some of the harmful effects of drug use are hidden and opaque. More often, they stare us in the face. We see the devastating toll that addiction takes on people's lives. We see the needless and oftentimes preventable loss of life through overdose and disease transmission. We see the impact of drug-related violence and intimidation in communities across the length and breadth of the country. Too many families have lost loved ones through addiction. I believe there is a strong consensus in this House and among the general public that the state and society generally need to respond far more effectively to the problems caused by illicit drugs use. We need more lives saved, more people in treatment and rehabilitation, more people in recovery. We need to reduce harm, reduce supply, reduce demand, and increase resilience, health and well-being in society. The programme for government, Our Shared Future, commits to progressing the establishment of 4 Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss, the type of directly elected mayor and local government structures best suited for Dublin, the future of education and drugs use. The first 2 of these, the Dublin Citizens' Assembly and the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss, have now concluded their work. The Dublin Citizens' Assembly submitted its final report and recommendations to the Oireachtas in December 2022. The Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss held its final meeting on the 21st of January last, and its report and recommendations will be submitted to the Oireachtas in the coming weeks. At its meeting last week, the Government agreed to the establishment of a Citizens' Assembly on drugs use. As Minister of State with responsibility for public health, well-being and the National Drug Strategy, I'm pleased to bring forward in this House the motion approving the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly on drugs use. The terms of reference for the Assembly have been designed so that they are sufficiently well defined to provide a clear focus for the Assembly. At the same time, they are not so prescriptive as to inhibit the scope of the Assembly to define its work programme as it deems appropriate. We've learned from previous experience of previous assemblies that the terms of reference should not be expressed in an overly precise way. Every Citizens' Assembly needs discretion and flexibility to define and organise its work programme as it deems appropriate. I believe that the proposed terms of reference for the Citizens' Assembly on drugs use, as set out in the motion before this House, provides sufficient scope for the Assembly to determine its work programme, to consider all issues it deems relevant to drugs use in Ireland and deliver carefully considered recommendations to the Oireachtas. The terms of reference state that the Assembly shall consider and make recommendations in respect of changes the state might make to significantly reduce the harmful impacts of drugs use on individuals, families, communities and wider society. In its considerations, the Assembly will be asked to take into account the implications for the health, justice and education systems. Part of the Assembly's work will be in developing an understanding of the lived experience of individuals, families and communities impacted by illicit drug use. This is hugely important. The voices of those most affected by illicit drugs use must be heard if the Assembly is to deliver on its mandate. Alongside this, the members will be asked to consider a range of perspectives on drugs use, both from a national viewpoint, but also from experiences across Europe and internationally. It will also consider the efficacy of current responses to drug use and best practice in promoting and supporting rehabilitation and recovery from drug addiction. Ireland is widely regarded as a world leader in deliberative democracy. Citizens' assemblies have become an important part of the Irish democratic process, and the recommendations of previous citizens' assemblies have influenced significant changes in how we in our state live our lives, including through constitutional change, legislative change, and changes in design and implementation of policy. It's clear to me that a citizens' assembly on drug use can make an invaluable contribution to inform the Oireachtas and government in our response to the challenging issue of drugs use. The Citizens' Assembly can also make a valuable contribution to a wider societal debate on drugs policy. There are differing viewpoints in this House among frontline service providers and among the general public about the most appropriate way to respond to the challenges posed by illicit drugs use. The Government has set out its approach in the National Drugs Strategy, which emphasises the importance of a health-led approach. In recent years, several Oireachtas committees have considered issues around drugs use, and I expect that Oireachtas members will follow with interest the progress of the Citizens' Assembly. The Assembly will engage comprehensively with professional bodies, stakeholders, representative groups and the general public, as well as national and international experts. It's important that the Assembly is afforded the time and the space to undertake its deliberations carefully and comprehensively. The Citizens' Assembly should and must operate entirely independently of government and the Oireachtas. There is, of course, a reporting relationship between the Citizens' Assembly and the Oireachtas. The motion before the House today proposes that the Assembly should report in the first instance to the Houses of the Oireachtas, which, on receipt of the final report of the Assembly, will refer the report to the relevant Oireachtas Committee for consideration. In addition, it's proposed that the Government will provide in the Houses of the Oireachtas a response to the recommendations of the Assembly and an indication of a proposed course of action where appropriate. The Dáil will debate the report of the Assembly and the Government's response. The Citizens' Assembly on drugs use will include an independent chairperson and 99 members of the general public selected from a random selection process. Building on the successful experience last year, eligibility for membership will extend beyond those enrolled on the electoral register to include all residents in the state. This opens the Citizens' Assembly up to non-Irish residents and others who, for whatever reason, are not enrolled on the electoral register. Recruitment will be done by a postal campaign with 20,000 randomly selected households invited to apply to participate in the Assembly. Members will be selected on the basis of gender, age and geographic location to ensure that the Citizens' Assembly is as representative as possible of wider Irish society. We have learned much from the experience of previous assemblies, and following the use of this process last year, I'm confident that this approach will continue to optimise the profile of the Citizens' Assembly. The timeline for the Citizens' Assembly is ambitious but achievable. The inaugural meeting of the Citizens' Assembly will take place in April, with the Assembly scheduled to conclude its work and submit its report by the end of this year. Ciancórla's successive Citizens' Assemblies have demonstrated how this unique exercise in deliberative democracy enhances Ireland's democratic system. Involving members of the general public in considering and proposing solutions to complex societal challenges makes an important contribution to the deliberative processes for government and the Oireachtas. It also enhances the public sphere, informing wider conversations and societal debates about matters of public importance. I know that you will join me by wishing the Citizens' Assembly well in undertaking the important work that it is being asked to do. Mullam and Tharshk and Shod and Tiach, and I commend this motion to the House.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now we go to Deputy Thomas Gould, sharing with Deputy Cullinan. Just to clarify on your amendment, there's two elements, but one amendment.
I'd like to move my amendment.
That's agreed.
Thank you. I'll be sharing with Mac Ward. Thank you. First of all, Minister, I want to begin by welcoming the movement on this Citizens' Assembly motion. This is an issue I've raised numerous times, and it is of the utmost importance that we see an Assembly convened as soon as possible and operate efficiently. I want to acknowledge the Trojan work that has been done by stakeholders like Citywide and members in this House and in the Shannon in keeping the pressure on and getting the Assembly to the stage. I think the Citizens' Assemblies have presented this House with an opportunity for us to work together, to work with communities and to put politics aside. This has allowed for improvement of society as a whole. We have seen the positive impact of citizens' assembly on the emotive and contentious issues. They have highlighted how informed, engaged and diligent our citizens are. Addiction and drug use can be a very highly emotive topic, and I know for families and individuals affected by addiction, this assembly may be very difficult. I want to know that their voices will be heard, and Minister, I want to acknowledge that you said that in your speech, that for those families who are at the coalface, who've suffered the most, that their voices will be heard, and I appreciate that. With this in mind, I've tabled 2 more amendments to the bill. These are not substantive amendments, as I recognise that the work that has gone in with the terms of reference, there's an opportunity, I believe, to strengthen those terms of reference. The first part of the motion recognises that recovery is not simple. It is a journey, and one of the bravest journeys a person can embark on. It is not linear, it is often very complex. It is a journey that requires support and that involves many difficult choices and tough decisions. I am very proud to have published the only specific policy on recovery on this island. Including in this policy is a commitment to the rights of those on a recovery journey to participate in the decision-making process. I think we must create space for those in recovery to participate in this assembly. I welcome the inclusion of the lived experience in the terms of reference. I would urge Minister to accept these amendments to further strengthen the space we are creating for people to expose their lived realities. Recovery is not easy. It is not a quick fix, but it is worthwhile, and to those in the recovery journey, they have a lot to teach us. The second part of the amendment allows the Citizens' Assembly to explore the role of task forces and emphasise the importance of localised, community-based approaches to addiction. We must recognise that the root cause of addiction is poverty. It recognises this. We must understand that tackling addiction means community-based initiatives that tackle poverty and recognise the harmful impacts of addiction. Groups at the coalface tell me that when task forces were first introduced, they enabled communities to be involved in the decision-making and to tackle the issues on the ground at a local level. This is a concern that has been echoed now, because over the past number of years, it seems that we have moved away from the task forces on the ground and listened to the community. And we need community leaders. We need to know. We need to move forward with a localised approach at the centre of our policy. I would ask Minister to consider these amendments. I acknowledge the Social Democrat amendment, and while I would not necessarily agree on every line, I recognise the spirit of the amendment and we will support it. I recognise that a Citizens' Assembly will explore more than addiction, and I welcome the conversation that will be had across the board. I hope these are constructive, respectful and dignified. I look forward to the recommendations of the Assembly and the positive change I'm sure we will see as a result. Minister, you talked about all those who've lost their lives to addiction and all the families that have been destroyed by it. I think this Citizens' Assembly will give us an opportunity to listen to those stories, and hopefully the Assembly will come forward with a report that we can all support.
Deputy Ward.
Thanks, Count Corlett. Minister, from the outset I want to put on the record that I really welcome that progress has been made on the Citizens' Assemblies on drugs. Sinn Féin have been calling for this to happen for the last 4 years or more. I'm from an area of high disadvantage, and I've seen the devastation that drugs has inflicted on my area since I was a child. I have lived in a community that has seen intergenerational of addiction and trauma within families, When I'm talking about high disadvantage, it's in relation to the government policy of the time of placing thousands of families from the same socio-economic backgrounds into the same areas without putting the necessary infrastructure and supports in place. And whilst we were put in a disadvantage by government policies, we were not at a disadvantage by the strength of character in our communities. Everything that we have in our community today, ordinary people like my parents, I see Gino Kenny here, his parents and the ordinary people around my area had to come out and fight tooth and nail for. And fight, they did. They fought for schools, they fought for something as simple as bus routes, access to local health services, community centres, everything, basically everything that the government failed to provide for. And unfortunately, many of our young people ended up in addiction over the years. Addiction that began as a way to escape the poverty and the trauma. Sometimes to escape multi-generational trauma of industrial schools, Magdalen laundries and mother and baby homes. Drugs give people the ability to self-soothe and to give calm to an anxious inner world. They work until they stop working and then the problems begin. I worked for years in addiction centres right across Dublin as a counsellor, key worker, outreach worker and as a manager. And I know the work our frontline services put in to help people addicted to drugs, their family and our wider communities. I welcome that we are now going to have a grown-up conversation on drugs in the form of a citizens' assembly. Every voice must be represented at this assembly. We have heard many calls of legalisation, decriminalisation, regulation and healthcare approach when it comes to drug use, and these voices must be represented. I'm not going to preempt what I think the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly are going to be, but I will call on the Government to start planning now for all eventual outcomes. For example, if we are to move to a decriminalised, regulated healthcare approach, then we must start resourcing our services now. There is no point bringing an end to the current legal situation in spite of commitments to a health-led approach without putting the appropriate resources in our community. We need to build on the crucial role of our community drug projects, as Deputy Gould was talking about, in responding to the needs of the individuals, families and communities, and recognise the need for significant and increased investment. As public representatives, it's incumbent on us to use the right language when it comes to talking about people with addiction problems. When you hear TDs from government parties dehumanising people by calling them junkies, this needs to be challenged, and it needs to be challenged at every single opportunity. It's not right and it's not fair, and it's not fair on the people who are suffering from addiction and their families. I want to also support Deputy Gould on the Sinn Féin amendment. Having that recovery voice is absolutely vital in this process. Last week I had a debate, this no wrong door bill, in relation to dual diagnosis, and as I said at the time, the government said the Citizens' Assembly could be one of the ways that this could be dealt with in the next year or so. So I'm asking you to guarantee that this will happen. I'm not saying the Citizens' Assembly will agree with what we're asking for, but that this dual diagnosis voice will be centre of the Citizens' Assembly. Just in the time that I have limited left, all voices must be heard, like voices of the families, voices of communities that have been ripped apart by criminality need to be central to this. We also need to hear our young people. I raised this before. The Citizens' Assembly only allows for 18 years or up to be part of that, but we must find a way that young people can have their voice heard at this, because that's really vitally important. We need to have, as I said, dual diagnosis. We need to have also people who are campaigning for legalisation, regularisation and decriminalisation. All needs to be part of this. And finally, on the subject of a Citizens' Assembly, I'm also calling on the Government to establish a Citizens' Assembly on Irish unity. Councils across the state have been supporting this call for a United Ireland Assembly, and we must see the immediate establishment of a Citizens' Assembly on Irish unity so we can reimagine, plan and include everybody in this conversation.
Thank you, Deputy Ward. Deputy O'Riordan.
Good morning, Corla, and Minister, I've already congratulated you for your efforts in this regard. I see former Minister Feenan behind you who did some work in this space as well. To me, this is one of the most important debates we're going to have in this House. I think it would be only fair for me to also acknowledge the efforts of the Green Party within Programme for Government discussions to make sure that there was a commitment to the establishment of a Citizens' Assembly, and also the Trojan work done by my colleague Nessa Horrigan from the Green Party to ensure that we got to this point. Minister, I appreciate the contribution you've made, and you've spoken very strongly about timelines. This is a once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to do something to stop the body count. And we have a body count of poor people. And if the body count was of anything else but poor people, we would have done something before now. And I say it with all sincerity, if the body count was of cattle, we would have done something by now. But the people who die from drug overdose just don't matter as much. As has been said, they're called names. They're called names even in this House. They're derided, they're dehumanised, their families are accused of poor parenting, their families can't come forward and talk about it. They're expected to travel from where they live to places miles away to get something as basic as methadone treatment. And they're hated and they're despised. And they're dying in huge numbers. We have the third highest overdose rate in Europe. So, Minister, we can't get this wrong. And my worry about this is, even though I am so appreciative of government of finally having this moment of establishing this assembly, if nothing comes out of this, then we will have raised expectations unfairly. We will have raised expectations unfairly, and we would have better off not having this conversation at all. If we come to a scenario where it reports by the end of the year, what happens then? It goes to a special committee of the Oireachtas. We all want to feed into that. There has to be a commitment from government to do something about it. Because in previous citizens' assemblies and constitutional conventions, we had the get-out clause as politicians to give it to the people. When it came to marriage equality, we could just give it to the people at the end of the day and let them decide. When it came to abortion, we could just give it to the people at the end of the day in terms of a referendum and let them decide. We had cover, but we can't do it with this. If we're going to make radical change to stop the body count of poor people effectively, then it takes, the responsibility is going to be here. It's going to take us to take that responsibility. Minister, the Labour Party don't have an amendment down, deliberately, and not because I'm trying to disagree with those who do have amendments down, because we want to start off this with a level of good faith, that we are absolutely going to work together collaboratively on this, that the stakes are far too high, that the lives being lost are far too valuable, and that we will do absolutely everything within our power to work with you and government and take the criticism and take the hit, because it's not a very popular political position to take, to be on the side of the person in addiction. It's much easier to go with the just say no, war on drugs line, pretending to be a tough guy. It is harder and politically more dangerous to take the case for those who are most vulnerable and who are dying in the biggest numbers from this epidemic. So we will take the risk and we'll work with you to get this over the line. But it will, Minister, require us to do it. We can't give this over to anybody else. And I would suggest to you that at the heart of this has to be the person who is a service user, the person in recovery, the person in addiction. That voice that we don't hear in the media. We don't hear that voice because that voice has been told to be ashamed of himself or herself. And society blames the victim, and it's their own fault. We are talking here about a central issue of inequality. If this comes down to a debate about drugs are bad for you, stop taking them, then it's a waste of oxygen. What we need to have is a realistic debate. Lots of people are taking drugs. Lots of people from all sorts of professions are taking drugs. Lots of people from different parts of the country are taking drugs. Lots of people from different age groups are taking drugs. But we treat people from a disadvantaged background differently, because you go down to any court in the country and you'll find it stuffed full of poor, sick people who don't belong there. So our thesis is, and I think it's replicated across this House, is that we can have a health-led approach, an exclusively health-led approach to those who are in addiction, and get rid of the criminalisation and the criminal justice approach to it. But, Minister, we have to do it, and it has to happen in the timeline of this Oireachtas. Otherwise, the body count is just going to pile higher and higher and higher, and none of us can have that on our conscience.
Oh, Deputy Higgins, sharing with Deputy Horrigan.
Thank you very much, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, citizens' assemblies play a crucial role in driving social and policy change across Ireland. Over the last number of years, we've seen how effective they are at starting a national discourse on the issues impacting people. And because of that, we are widely regarded as a world leader when it comes to deliberative democracy. The recommendations of previous citizens' assemblies have influenced significant changes in how we in this state live our lives. And they can, and they indeed do, lead to constitutional change, legislative change, and changes in design and implementation of policy. They lead to changes in society. And I really welcome the commitment to establishing a citizens' assembly on drug use, because the prevalence of drug use and addiction in Ireland has reached a very worrying level. And meanwhile, underground drugs trade booms on our streets, and it preys on young people in vulnerable communities. And I think that the connection between casual drug taking and the funding of the illegal drugs trade isn't always made. Minister Simon Harris made that point very well last week in this chamber, and your predecessor, former Minister Frank Feehan, articulated that so well when he met with constituents of mine in Clondalkin recently. And I think it's something that we have to highlight as much as we can. What is clear is that our current approach to drug use isn't working completely. It isn't having the impact it needs to have from a health standpoint or from a criminal standpoint. And who better to inform our future approach than people themselves? People who have lived experience of patterns and of trends and of changing attitudes around drug use in Ireland. Drug use can be a hugely divisive topic, with view and opinions spanning a very wide spectrum, and that's why a citizens' assembly is the perfect vehicle for public dialogue. Obviously, the discussion in this space is often dominated by the question of legalisation, and I do think that's a really important question, and it's one I think we as a society are ready to discuss, and I'm glad that will be discussed as part of the citizens' assembly. By investigating the opportunities and challenges of reforming legislation and policy in this space, we'll be able to look at how we could potentially change our response to drug use when it comes to health, to education and to the criminal justice system. But the remit of the Citizens' Assembly must also go further than that. It must look at drug use in Ireland using a whole-of-society approach, including things like attitude and trends in relation to drug use, the impact of drug use on individuals, on families, on communities and on society. Best practice in promoting and supporting rehabilitation and recovery from drug addiction. The lived experience of young people and of adults affected by drug use. International, national and local perspectives. And the efficacy of current policy and response to drug use. I think as well we need to look at the international best practice when it comes to reducing supply, demand and harm and increasing resilience, health and well-being. We're seeing some concerning trends in this space and we cannot and must not ignore those trends. Discussion around state response, policy, education and addiction and even more areas are really needed. And I think we all, as a society, look forward to hearing the report from the Citizens' Assembly. I'm glad to say that this sounds like it might be something that will happen this year, and I think we really do need to focus on it. It's time as a nation we stood up and had an adult conversation around drug use and the way forward.
Deputy Horrigan.
Well, first of all, I'd like to very warmly welcome the establishment of the Drug Citizens' Assembly and the good work of the Minister and Deputy Feehan in the past on pushing forward with it. I think when we first got into the programme for government, we viewed it as a way of allowing the complexity of the drugs debate to be on the table in a way that wasn't under the consistent pressure of political debate, but that it would allow that conversation to happen and be based in evidence and in experience. And I'm really hopeful that that might actually happen. But more than anything, I suppose I view it as a way for people who rarely get a chance to have their voices heard to speak up and to do that and to kind of raise their heads above the parapet and make their views known. It's a way for families who feel like they've lost their loved ones, even though those loved ones might be here with us, that they've effectively lost them to tell that story and what that feels like. And it's a chance for people in addiction to explain to us as a cohort and to the Citizens' Assembly as a cohort of this government too, how the laws that we make in here might impact and improve or damage their lives. And it's a chance for people who choose to take what we describe as illicit drugs, who choose it every day and feel that that's okay, just to explain what their thinking is. And it's a chance for communities to outline how so many issues, from poverty, deprivation, criminalisation, intimidation, from gang activity to debt to mental health and a million other things, are impacted by the drugs debate and are related and entangled in the issue of illicit drugs. There is an immense social cost to the continued increase in drug use in Ireland as it currently stands. And I really think that the people who are lucky enough to get on the Drug Citizens' Assembly, they might not feel that like that when their name is picked out of the hat, but I consider them very lucky to enter into this debate. I think that they might actually save lives in the long term. And I'm going to echo what Deputy O'Riordan said, which is I really hope that we can hold the person in the very heart of the discussion. So what I mean by that is the drugs will come and go, because, you know, we'll talk about crack cocaine and cannabis this year, but it could be fentanyl next year. I see that happening in the US, and it is very, very scary. And in the US, they're not talking about drug gangs anymore. They're not talking about supply, because you can go into a lab and you can make this stuff, no problem. So the substances themselves will change, but we don't change. People don't change unless we're brave enough to do it. And I really hope we can put that right at the very centre of it. So I would urge, you know, the political establishment, and by that I mean us, the government, to you know, both in the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly, but also in our response afterwards, because the time will be tight. The time of the Citizens' Assembly is actually fairly lively, but in terms of us being able to turn it around and actually legislate, it's pretty tight. So, you know, I would hope that we would not focus too much on particular substances, but on the structures and on people's motivations and the structures of legislation and the structure of services. I suppose I do want to say that, like, the journey over the last couple of years, whether it was Deputy Fien or Deputy Minister Naughton that we were dealing with, the journey to get here has been genuinely collaborative and cross-party, and you know, Deputy O'Riordan mentioned that already, but people like Senator Ruane and Deputy McAuliffe and Deputy Cairns, and I see Deputy Gannon there, and you know, our partners with Sinn Féin. I have to say, I do think, you know, people like Deputy Dáil and Deputy Gould speaking out is so incredibly important. I do think maybe that the people who speak up about this, it's not necessarily about party politics, but it's about those of us who are living it, whether it's because you're in a constituency where it's really meaningful and you see, like on the streets of Dublin Central, there are mammies who, like, their 12-year-old is a lookout for a drugs gang and she does not know what to do, and she's coming to me and I don't know what to do. And it's a very difficult conversation. And I do think that either you've lived it in your own family, I know there are some of us who have lived it in our own families, but also you're maybe representing a constituency where it is on the street every day and there are people desperate coming to you, and that's why you're willing to enter into the debate. And I think all of any party or none who are there on that issue, I hope we can keep you in the debate and that you'll work on pushing this through before this government is over. I echo Deputy Daly's concern about sorry, Deputy Ward, about not second-guessing the recommendations of the Assembly. But I know one thing for absolute certain as we're going into it, is that what we're doing right now in terms of drug legislation has failed. It has failed badly. The debts are too high, the cost is too much, and today is the day that we could start doing better for people.
Thank you very much, Deputy Horrigan. Now we go to Deputy Paul Donnelly. You have 3.5 minutes, Deputy Donnelly.
I'd like to welcome the Citizens' Assembly on drug use. This is something that has needed to happen for many years, and can I commend all of those who campaigned and who worked hard to get this far, and acknowledge that there is no one single voice on this issue. And whilst we are talking about a Citizens' Assembly, I'd like to also call on the government to stop dragging its heels and to establish a Citizens' Assembly on Irish unity as soon as possible, to give all the people a say on the future of our island. Drug misuse and abuse destroys individuals, families and communities. For many decades, there has been one way in tackling the issue of mind-altering illegal and abused legal drugs. Our fractured communities are struggling and ever-expanding drug support services have had enough, I think, of the so-called war on drugs, which in effect means a war in working-class communities. It has led to a criminalisation of a vast amount of young and older people who have been left with criminal records, and has affected the entirety of their lives. I welcome that we are looking at international best practice, and I look forward to some of the models now used across the world being explored and discussed, and how we can use some of those best practice and adapt it to an Irish context. I acknowledge that the Citizens' Assembly will be looking at the lived experience of young people and adults affected by drug use, as well as their families and communities. I hope that we also look at the lived experience of young and, again, older people around non-problematic drug use. And we need to hear the voice of those who use drugs on a recreational basis. It's important that that voice is heard also in this debate. It's recognised the world over that we can never rid our communities of drugs, but the Citizens' Assembly can chart a way forward that will help get rid of the blight of drug debt intimidation, local, national and international drug gangs who maintain their iron grip on our communities through murder, violence and intimidation. I hope that the Citizens' Assembly can help get us to where communities' voice is heard again and respected. As someone who was involved in the establishment of the Drugs Task Force a good number of years ago, also community-led, community drug projects, therapeutic and youth supports, I know that the community-led approach works. And a lot of us know this in this room as well. And unfortunately, in the last 10 years at least, that has certainly been very challenging. I'd like to commend all those working on the coalface, supporting those with problematic drug use and supporting young people, especially those, again, on the local drugs task force, the family support networks, the brilliant work of our community drug teams in Dublin 15. We have a Tolka River rehabilitation programme, our counselling services in Genesis and Blanchardstown Community Services, our youth services such as Feroga, MYP and BMYI in Mountfew and Blakestown, and all those mothers and fathers, families and the unpaid community activists who keep the struggle going to help and support people who are addicted to drugs and who are in recovery. And finally, I'd like to ask members to support Deputy Gold's 2 amendments to this bill. Go to Mail Thank
you very much, Deputy Donnelly. And I think Deputy Ellis will be taking your time when it comes. No, not yet, because we have Deputy Holly Kearns now sharing her time with Deputy Gary Gannon.
Thank you, Cian Corla. While I really welcome this motion establishing the Citizens' Assembly on drugs use, it is truly shocking that it's taken this long. There are almost 2 drug-related deaths in Ireland every day. This rate is amongst 5 times the figure of those who died in road traffic accidents, and it is twice that of the European average. Now that we have the Assembly, it is essential that it is empowered to fully discuss and examine the complex issues involved, while learning from the experiences of those affected and effective policies in other jurisdictions. The Government's proposal for what the Assembly will consider is irresponsibly narrow. It doesn't cover the impacts of criminalisation of drug use and possession, which is a key component of understanding a medicalised approach to drug use. We need to face up to not only the harm caused by drugs, but also the harm of systems that punish addiction. There is no reference to the importance of wraparound services to help individuals recover from drug addiction. Also missing is the need for an Assembly to hear from international best practice around drug policy and operational approaches. We have a significant opportunity to learn from the success and challenges of Portugal and other countries who have transformed their approaches to drugs to considerable success. This is a long overdue conversation, but like the other assemblies, it must be given a broad remit to examine and discuss all aspects of drugs policy and their impacts. Previous citizens' assemblies and the Constitutional Convention have proven that the general public, especially when equipped with the facts, are way ahead of the government on important social issues. Well, drugs are a social issue, a health issue and a class issue. I have submitted an amendment to the motion to allow the Assembly to have a fuller examination of drugs policy and its impacts on individuals, their families and whole communities. As is, I don't believe the government's wording is unrestrictive enough, and it won't facilitate the conversations that we desperately need. The strength of the Citizens' Assembly model is in giving them the freedom to discuss any topic and make recommendations based on evidence and their deliberations. So let us give them the widest possible remit to critically engage with this complicated area.
Let me, in the broadest and most warmest sense, welcome the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs. As I was sitting here listening to a previous speaker mentioning the pathway to this much-needed and long overdue assembly, I was thinking to myself the journey that has taken place in communities all over this country, and in my own in particular in the North Inner City. If we believe the Citizens' Assembly reflects best that democracy is a forum where these ideas are going to be discussed, trashed out and improved, which has been the case in the past. I remember my first political engagements many years ago was on my local drugs task force as a community rep. When that was my first involvement politically, the very first political meetings I'd ever been at in the North Inner City as a kid were assemblies about the scourge of drug addiction in their communities. These assemblies on the discussion of the atrocious, incredibly devastating impact on communities, individuals and families have been taking place around this country for decades. And it's with that in mind that I strongly implore you, Minister, and the people who will be involved in creating this scenario in a very short space of time, there will be an incredible responsibility placed on those lucky enough to be on this assembly. But looking in from, I don't want to say outside, but certainly looking in with great curiosity will be the communities and the families who have been impacted by this scourge in many ways. And I don't want to do that. I know it has been a scourge in terms of the devastating impact on it, who will be wanting to know what's happening. They'll want to feel engaged. So, Minister, I would ask you to find the means by which we can explain to all of the communities about the purpose of the Citizens' Assembly, the matters that are going to be discussed, the ramifications of it, because this will be a topic of conversation throughout all of our communities who have been devastated by this issue over the last 4 decades. I do want to conclude by referencing some of the people in my own community who have demonstrated huge leadership over this issue over the last 4 decades. And in particular, when I go out and talk to the communities about this assembly, the person who I'll miss most is Mr. Fergus McCabe, who passed away a couple of years ago. He's the founder of Citywide, a number of other kind of drug-related responses, and communities leaders such as Fergus, who for years demonstrated incredible leadership in kind of fighting back against the scourge of addiction and bringing care and compassion to the forefront of this issue, will be sadly missed. And there's a job of work on all of us around the political and civic leadership space to talk to our communities about the Assembly, and a job of work for all of us across the Chamber who will be on the bodies afterwards to work with great speed in terms of implementing its recommendations. I think we can do it, and I'm very excited about it, and congratulate you, both of you, for bringing it to the fore.
Now we have Deputy Frank Feehan sharing with Deputy Cormac Devlin. Deputy Feehan.
First of all, I want to thank you, Minister, for bringing forward this motion approving the establishment of a Citizens' Assembly on drug use. I also want to thank all the other stakeholders and people here at the Dáil and the Shannon and many people who have pursued this in a very, very measured way. And I'm delighted that after many, many years, the Citizens' Assembly will start. And also, I just want to also highlight the National Drug Strategy that's in since 2017 to 2025, reducing harm, supporting recovery, brought a health-led approach to people who use drugs. And I think that's something that we certainly should acknowledge as well, the great work that was done there. The terms of reference to the City Assembly, I believe, it has sufficient scope for the carefully considered recommendations which will come to the Oireachtas. And I think there's huge scope here that to reduce the harmful impacts of drug use on individuals, families, communities and the wider society. And I think the Citizens' Assembly will take into account the implications for the health, justice and education systems as well. This isn't a Dublin problem, it isn't a city problem. Unfortunately, individuals and families and communities, they're affected by harmful impact of illicit drug use in every town, village and city and rural area in this country. And what we want to do is to reduce the harm and the risks of harm caused by illicit drugs. Yesterday I was in Ballybuffet at a drug-related intimidation and violence engagement seminar, which is bringing people together to deal with drug-related intimidation. And it's happening not just in cities, again, it's happening in every area of our country, and I want to commend the people who are working on that. We need more lives saved, and there's more people in treatment and rehabilitation, and also people in recovery. And again, we want to reduce harm, reduce supply, reduce demand, and as we look for a health-led approach and well-being in our country. The Citizens' Assembly's work will be developing an understanding, I suppose, individuals, families and the communities impacted by illicit drugs. And I think we need those voices, from the drug user to the families and to those affected by illicit drug use in our country, and I think this needs to be heard. Ireland, when I go around the world, and Ireland is regarded as a world leader in citizen assemblies, and I think we have led the way in a lot of areas. And I think it's a great way of taking the politics out of very, very delicate and very emotive and very difficult situations, and I think that's what the Citizen Assembly has done. I'm looking forward to seeing the Assembly engage comprehensively with professional bodies, stakeholders, representative groups and the general public, and I also look forward to seeing national and international experts, and I think we need that time and space. Just one aspect of which I'd like to highlight. I was in Colombia earlier this year, or last August, and they're taking a different approach to the war on drugs. And the approach that they look at, and which is something I didn't realise, and I think something that we all need to, is that they see the United States, they see Europe, and they see Ireland and the United Kingdom as the problem. We are the market, you know, and every time we think of Colombia, sometimes people think of drug cartels and somebody thinks of corrupt governments. What's happening in Colombia is absolutely disgraceful, and anybody who talks about snorting cocaine and taking whatever, they talk about fair trade. Fair trade, developed countries giving a fair price to developed countries. But just think about the farmers who have been punished by their crops being destroyed, deployment of troops to cocoa growing areas. It's cost billions. It's claimed the lives of thousands of innocent farmers, innocent civilians and soldiers in clashes and drug-related violence. There has to be sustainable alternatives to farmers harvesting cocoa, and cocoa buyers and the drug cartels have moved in. They've moved in from Mexico. They've taken over all these areas. So when you're snorting your cocaine, you know, we think about the children, think about the families in Ireland. Think about the tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of farmers, of innocent people in those countries, whom your money is going to help to keep these imprisoned by drug cartels. It's just an aspect I think should be brought to the Citizens' Assembly. It's an aspect that that I think has been highlighted. It's an aspect that I saw. They came to me, they pleaded that they needed help. The government needed help. And it's an aspect of, it's something that I think that we, in following on from Minister Harris's, I suppose, comments in the last few days, it's an aspect that we need to think about. If you're talking about free trade and fair trade and coffee, there's people now that are under repression by drug cartels, and there is no escape. And it's just something I think that we need to discuss. It's something we need to talk about. But again, I want to thank you, Minister. I want to thank the officials in the department. But I want to thank each and every one of you in opposition and in government for the measured way that you discussed, the way you brought your feelings to the floor of the Dáil. And I think this augurs very, very well for the Citizens' Assembly. Much anticipated, much needed. and it will save lives. Thank you.
Deputy, we move now to Sinn Féin slot. Morrisville, Deputy Equivalent.
Firstly, I want to welcome the proposed Citizens' Assembly on drug use. It's long overdue, and I wish those who will be members the very best in their deliberations. But to be clear, in the first instance, we are the Citizens' Assembly. The people of this state have elected us to legislate on these issues, and while the input of the Assembly will be most welcome, this cannot be a case of taking their feedback and allowing it to gather on a shelf. The time for action on drugs is now. The approaches that have been taken over previous generations have failed utterly. The so-called war on drugs has been an absolute disaster. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro has stated recently that the war on drugs has killed more than 1 million people in Latin America without denting the power of drug traffickers or without denting the supply of drugs into Europe and the USA. The old approach of criminalisation of users has failed so many drug users, their families and many of our communities. I've been a member of the local drug and alcohol forum in Limerick for more than 12 years, and I've seen firsthand the devastation that addiction can have not just on the user but their families and indeed the wider community. A dependency on illicit drug use can rip families apart. I've spoken to mothers and fathers who put themselves in debt, grandfathers and grandmothers who put themselves in debt to try and pay their child's or grandchildren's dealer. I've seen others make the difficult decision of reporting their own children to the Garda Síochána. It is my hope that the Citizens' Assembly will be able to consider the impact of illicit drug use on the lives of the family members of those who have been consumed by addiction and how we as a state can better support them. Unfortunately, these types of scenarios have become more prevalent in Limerick over the last 3 years. The scourge of heroin remains, but it has been added to by the introduction of cheaper and highly addictive crack cocaine. It has taken a hold on my beautiful city of Limerick, and it is devastating. It often serves not just as a substitute to heroin, but a complement to it. In 2020, in this chamber, I raised my concerns about the surge in the availability of crack cocaine in Limerick. I stated that I had a concern that the usage of this addictive form of cocaine would increase unless action was taken. Regretfully, I was unfortunately proven right. Despite the efforts of the Garda Síochána and drug support organisations, the use of crack cocaine has become widespread across Limerick. Indeed, the drug supermarket referenced previously in this chamber by myself on a number of occasions continues to operate on a 24/7 basis. It is from here that so much of the crack cocaine in my city has been sold. There needs to be a greater police focus on the operations of such shops and less of a focus on those unfortunate people enough to become dependent on this substance. I and my party see harm reduction and prevention as our guiding lights in our approach to the issue of drug misuse. In that vein, I welcome the holistic approach due to be taken in Limerick very, very soon in response to those who are using crack cocaine. The Garda Síochána have committed to an approach that will see them, with the consent of the user, refer the user to the Analyfi project for support. The law engagement and assisted recovery approach has been in Dublin since 2014, and I hope this adoption in Limerick, specifically in relation to crack cocaine, will free up resources to tackle not the unfortunate users, but rather the higher-end peddlers who profit from this misery. I would like to acknowledge the work of organisations in Limerick such as Analyfi, who have been in the Midwest for the last 10 years, and the North Star Family Support Project, who help families. They do tremendous non-judgmental work with both users and their families. They're workers and tremendous people who do so much good on a daily basis. And briefly, in the time left to me, I would hope that the work on the Assembly will look at models across the world in terms of whether they've been successful and to whether parts or all of those alternative approaches could be implemented in Ireland. The Portuguese model that has been in place for 20 years is where it starts looking. While it hasn't been a panacea for everything, it's not perfect in everything, it has led to a reduction in deaths, a massive reduction among the people in prison due to drug addiction, and has reduced infections on HIV, hepatitis, and all this sort of stuff. So we need to look at what works across the world, take the best parts of those. But what we can't do is sit here in this chamber, subcontract this out to Citizens' Assembly. We'll come back hopefully with a good response and good report that we deal with it as fast as we can and address this issue, because it's causing huge devastation, as I said, Gordon Market.
We move to Deputy Kenny.
Minister, obviously I welcome the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly on drug use. I think it's a very important debate, probably one of the most important debates of this generation in relation to drug use. Why it took 3 years in the lifetime of this government beggars belief, and why it's taken decades to come to this level of discussion also beggars belief. And we've seen other models across the world where they treat kind of drug addiction, drug use more holistically and with more empathy. Because by locking people up, and the majority of people in Irish prisons are there for some form of in the drugs business, that shows you the level of failure that the state has, the policy in relation to those that, are in the drugs industry. The majority of people that are in prison are there for that purpose. And we've seen other models across the world, such as Portugal. They've saved lives, and I've said in this chamber many times, if it can save one life, then a change of policy is worthwhile. I don't think we can talk about decriminalisation without talking about regulation. Because under decriminalisation, and it is a much better model than the status quo, under decriminalisation, the black market still exists. So all the drugs that we're talking about are still illegal. And what gives the game away on this failed policy, and I've said this again many times, and nobody's come up with an answer, all the controlled drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act are controlled by who? They're not controlled by you. They're controlled by the black market. So that gives the game away. As long as the black market exists and there's, I suppose, a demand for drugs, the black market and drug, I suppose, demand will still exist. So, and I don't say this to dilute the issue of decriminalisation, but we have to talk about regulation. We have to talk about regulation of some drugs that are illicit, such as cannabis and possibly other drugs. We have to, because otherwise the black market still continues. You're decriminalising the person, which is good, but you need to go further than that. And I think public opinion has shifted on this, Minister. I really do. I think in the last number of years, public opinion is beyond, I think, opinion in here. I think the status quo has kind of led to a rot of, to keep the status quo because people didn't see an alternative. And I think there is an alternative now, and I think public opinion is looking at alternatives in relation to this issue. It's complex, and drug use can be very, very dark, to say the least. I've seen it in my own community, where drugs have taken a hold of people, have taken hold of families, have taken hold of communities, and it's absolutely ugly. It's pretty ugly. But even when I've seen all that, and looking back now, do I think there's a better model and a better way to treat people that fall into addiction? Because of many kind of, I suppose, reasons. Poverty, alienation. People take drugs for all sorts of reasons. People take drugs through trauma, But if a person has a problem with alcohol, we don't send them to prison. But if a person has a problem or a dependency on drugs, they're alienated and they will be sent to prison. So that's why I think the system is a failure. And, in the last 50 years, via the Misuse of Drugs Act, we look at the proliferation of all drugs. In the last 50 years, exponentially, the demand for drugs across the world has risen. It's impossible to stop drug demand, the sale of drugs and so forth. And I think even the President of Colombia, Colombia have suffered absolutely terribly in the last number of decades in relation to the narco wars. They've lost hundreds of thousands of people. And even the President of Colombia is saying, look, man, this policy just ain't working anymore. We have to do something different. And I believe other countries now are following suit to look at something different models. The model is kind of decriminalisation, but again, Minister, I kind of emphasise that regulation, looking at how you take control back from the myriad of the black market. Because the black market are a small amount of people have enriched themselves through violence and vast amount of money. It's incredible the amount of money they have. They're so powerful. But the only way to undermine them is taking control back. Because if you don't take control back, they will always have control. So you need to take control back. That's a wider argument, but hopefully we can have that argument over the next coming months and years. Thank you.
We'll move to a government slot. Deputy Moran O'Connor, sharing with Deputy McCauley.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. And Minister, it is very welcome that we bring together a citizens' assembly on drug use.
We have to find a better way to meet the diverse health needs of people who use drugs and at the same time explore ways to prevent the harmful impact on drugs on children, families and communities. And Minister, I have seen myself families torn apart where maybe a child or someone in that family has started taking drugs and they have been crying out for help. So I think this is going to be absolutely crucial. If you look at the Port of Antwerp, Europe's second largest container terminal, is well known as a prominent entry point for illicit drugs shipped to Europe from Latin America. Last month, data reported to the EMCDDA highlighted how cocaine seizures in Antwerp have risen from 91 tonnes in 2021 to close to 110 tonnes in 2022, making Antwerp the leading port for cocaine seizures in Europe. That seems far away, but Minister, it's actually not. We see the rise in this leading to a rise in competition between criminal networks and increase in violence and clashes all the time. We see this violence spilling over to those outside the drug market. That's the criminal side of drug use, and we need to call it out. On the other side, across the country, service providers dealing with people suffering due to drug use or addiction or facing closure because of lack of funding, and that's the huge issue. There are so many places, great facilities that are crying out for funding, and it's not there, and there is an increase in demand. Local and regional drug and alcohol task forces in communities all needing funding. The use of drugs is on the rise and people need to be educated about the links between drug use and long-term mental health issues. If we saw greater investment in the local task forces, then we could achieve that change. I go to all the joint policing committee meetings and all over the country, time and time again, drugs is always cited as one of the most challenging problems in society, and they are always asking for more resources. It is vital that we hear the voice of young people on this topic, as they can be particularly impacted by drug use. I look forward to hearing the outcome of the consultation with Cornanog and the youth drug projects in disadvantaged areas, which will be presented to the Citizens' Assembly for its consideration in its inauguration meeting in April 2023. And when it concludes its work and submits a report to the Oireachtas by the end of 2023, I will be eager to hear what steps we can take to best reflect a partnership approach and give a stronger voice to the civil society implementing of the drug use strategy. And I think, Minister, that is crucial. I think all of us have to be so mindful of drug use in this country, and I really want to welcome this. Thank you.
I want to welcome the legislation, Minister, before us, and I see Minister Feehan has just left, and I know the former Minister Feehan, I know the contribution that he made in the preparation of this. But it's important to say that we would not have got here without very significant voices in all political parties and many people at a community level who have been calling for this. We know that the Misuse of Drugs Act is not working. Drug use has increased over that time, and we have huge resources by the state trying to tackle the management or the implementation of that Misuse of Drugs Act. So the 100 people at the Citizens' Assembly, I think, have a very difficult task. Many of them will be coming to it with no background in awareness of addiction or the illness that is addiction. Many of them may come from communities that have experienced this for many years. Many will come from communities where perhaps the problem is more hidden. But we should be clear, the drugs issue impacts every community in the country. Perhaps it's more open in some. And those 100 people will come together, and I think they will have to tackle the issue of the legal framework, but also the service provision. And there's a tendency that in this debate we get lost in the argument around decriminalisation or regulation, but this access to services is absolutely key in the outcomes of the Citizens' Assembly. Look, I don't want to say too much in advance of it because in some ways you're preempting the work, but my own view is that, as other speakers have said here, the illegal drugs industry has grown to such a scale, to such a size, the international networks, the resources that they can deploy, the willingness to use violence. we have effectively put some of the most vulnerable people in our society, those people with an addiction, at the end of a supply chain for that illegal drugs industry. And so whatever we can do to make sure that those people with problematic drug use can be protected from that network, I think is something we should consider. In my view, decriminalisation of the person would be a very necessary first step in that. And that's not to say that we believe the consumption of drugs is a positive thing. We all consume alcohol, or many people consume alcohol, and we know the negative impacts it has. Many people smoke tobacco, and we know the negative impacts that has. So saying that it should not be a criminal offence for people to use some of the current illegal substances it's not an endorsement of the use of those substances. It's an endorsement of a compassionate approach to those people who find themselves having problematic drug use. Just think, if you or your son or your daughter, your mother, your aunt found themselves in a position where they had a problematic drug use, do you want the guard calling to their door, or do you want a counsellor or a nurse or a doctor? And that very simply answers the question, do we want a justice-led approach or a health-led approach? But politicians can't hide behind that phrase, a health-led approach. We actually have to spell out what it actually means. And I believe decriminalisation of the person is that necessary first step, because what it does is it removes the criminal sanction and allows us to concentrate on other alternative approaches, such as those used in Portugal. But we shouldn't rely too heavily on the Portuguese model. We should come up with an Irish model that I think is compassionate. And that idea of your brother, your sister, your family member, I think that's how we persuade people out there that this is the right way forward. Because we've had these difficult conversations in the past, societal conversations that require referenda changes. And the resistance is also often eliminated when we bring it back to the human level, the example of your neighbour or your friend and so on. And I really believe that in some ways we have a very hypocritical approach to drug use in Ireland, given the scale of use of one type of drug, alcohol, the availability of, for example, methadone. It's a legal product that's actually supplied free of charge by the state. And then there are other classifications of drugs that we make illegal. So there's no consistency in how we approach this. And in the end of the day, this is about somebody who has an addiction. And regardless of the substance, addiction is an illness, and it is something that needs to be tackled. I think this is an opportunity for Ireland to be compassionate, to have a grown-up conversation. I'd encourage people right across the board, not just in the Assembly. We need to get people outside the Assembly speaking about this issue too. We need to have this adult conversation, and I think we need to make the changes in the legal framework and in the service provision that protects those people who find themselves in problematic drug use.
Thank you, Deputy. Next, Sinn Féin Deputy
Ellis. Minister, the establishment of a Citizens' Assembly on drug use is long overdue, and hopefully this April we will have in position the necessary 100 people to look at this and to consider all aspects of drug use, recovery, facilities, legal and policing issues, as well as the roles of task forces and policing committees. Drug task forces, for which I am a long-time member, the Finglas Cabra Drugs Task Force, have done marvellous work with very, very poor resources. I hope the Citizens' Assembly will be in a position to look at this in terms of the financing of these, because I think they've been let down over the years, many of the drugs task forces. Drug intimidation is also a major issue in mainly working class areas, and people are crying out for help. Guidance and help is needed, and maybe we will come up with some answers with the Citizens' Assembly. Recovery needs to be a key focus of the Assembly, and the works of groups like Recovery Academy, Smart Recovery and Solcha will be reflected in the work. Sinn Féin are the only party on the island with a specific policy focused on recovery and the rights of people, and we need to make sure the Assembly explores how to support people who are in recovery. We need to listen to people who work on the ground, to learn from their experiences and invest in health and social care to reduce long waits to access residential rehab. We also need to hear from those who have experienced drug and alcohol use and those who have gone through recovery. Since 2017, we have had legislative provision for supervised injecting facilities to help reduce harm and death from addiction and heroin use. The establishment of the first facility at Merchants Quay Ireland facility is long overdue and has been delayed for many years. It has only recently received permission to go ahead. The conversation in this space has now moved to supervised consumption rooms for a wider range of substances, and this should be explored by the CA. The issue of dual diagnosis is one area that needs urgent attention, and I commend FAST and Finglas and the Ballymun's Drugs Task Force for the work they've done in this area, and I hope they will get a day out with the Assembly. Open drug dealing is now common, and in some areas it's fairly visible on the street, but it's also, as we've seen in the city centre of Dublin, where it's quite visible. But one of the worst areas it's around schools. And I think the effect that this has on minors and other people, this needs to be explored, and whether zones should be set up to deal with this in regards to keeping the drugs out of the school areas and the proximity to schools. There's also the issue of the proceeds of crime. I would hope that maybe the Assembly would have a word in regards to that. This should be directed into areas where the major seizures are being got, and the most affected areas. And I would like to think that they might have some thing in regards to that. The attitude of people to people who have addiction problems is appalling, and that is something we need to get out. We need to educate people. We need to, cocaine has become a major substance use in our society. You see it in pubs, you see it everywhere. It's been even in Dáil, Éireann. So we've seen all these where it's become acceptable. Education is needed. We need to teach people that this is unacceptable. I suppose we need experts from all areas. That's not just from locally and all the different groups, but from outside of the country to have an input. I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. We will move now to Regional Group. Deputy Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I would like to commend the Government on the National Drug Strategy, which rightly promotes a more compassionate and humane approach to people who use drugs. By treating addiction as a health issue rather than solely as a criminal justice issue, we have the opportunity to educate and empower people at an individual level to improve their health, well-being and the quality of life through the promotion of rehabilitation and recovery. The establishment of a citizen assembly on drug users is another step forward in reducing the harmful impact of illicit drugs on individuals, families and communities and the wider society. The resulting policy has the opportunity to make a significant difference in the promotion of health and addiction recovery in Ireland. Prevalence of drug use in recent years is shocking. For example, in Europe, Ireland is among the highest users of cocaine, with cocaine now more common than alcohol. However, there is a significant link between alcohol use and cocaine use. According to the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addictions, an estimated 7.8% of the Irish population has used cocaine in their lifetime, with the average age of first-time regular use is 22 years of age. Substance abuse is through the roof, and I passionately welcome the creation of the Assembly so that those most affected can impact decision-makers on drug policies. There is not a day that goes by that I do not speak with a constituent who has been affected by drug use and addiction. Research shows a significant link between trauma, drug use and addiction. Trauma includes anything from adverse childhood experience, poverty and stress, to name a few, where people use drugs as a coping mechanism to numb their pain and stress. Adolescents are particularly vulnerable to drug use and addiction, while their brains are still developing and maturing, and there are studies highlighting that drug use in adolescents create a vulnerability for drug addiction in later life. This is why education is paramount. But let me be clear, drug use affects all members of society, whether homeless, a CEO, adolescents in their 50s, directly or through families and communities. Everyone is affected. The Assembly will examine the range of issues around illicit drugs use in Ireland, consider the lived experience of people impacted by drug use, as well as their families and communities. Citizens' Assembly will have become an important part of Ireland's democratic process and has made a significant contribution to the process, constitution reform and changes. The widening of the selection process to include all residents in the states, including non-Irish and those normally hard-to-reach groups who are not on the electoral register, is applauded. I would also expect the Assembly would listen to qualified experts at the field of addiction. Given the growing prevailing rate in Irish society, and awareness regarding the brain and behavioural effects of substance use is crucial so that the transition from casual use to addiction can be understood, and so legislation and policy can incorporate biological, psychological and social dimension. Furthermore, I expect to see an international component of Citizens' Assembly whereby African strategy, policy and corporate response to drug use are evaluated and pulled apart. Merging the best practice from European Union Drug Strategy 2021 to 2025, Sláinte Care Implementation Strategy and Action Plan 2021 to 2023, and Healthy Ireland Strategic Action Plan 2021 to 2025 strategy should result in an all-consumer policy. Government will then need to push forward the resulting recommendations to policy measures regarding education and the provision of services. Combining a preventative approach with a person-centred recovery strategy is crucial. However, it must be acknowledged that drug markets and drugs are continuously evolving. The drug war in my constituency of Loudon East Meath is frightening. Drugs are everywhere, and the likes of heroin are becoming more common. It is crucial that we keep on top of new substances coming on stream and their transition into the community. Sharing of information and intelligence, both nationally and internationally, has been very useful. Policy must incorporate operational responses to drug use, taking into consideration the implementation for health, criminal justice and education systems. Many people who use drugs problematically come into contact with criminal justice system and acquire criminal convictions either directly or indirectly relating to their drug use. I see this daily. The scale of societal problems around drugs is such that it now needs a dedicated resource to drive change. This Assembly and government intervention. A critical element of the Assembly on drug use is the cooperation and collaboration between the departments, agencies and support services. A coordinated government approach is required alongside strategy bodies and civil society. For example, a young girl came in to see me recently who had a problem with alcohol. She's only 18 years of age. Her parents threw her out. I rang the parents and they wanted nothing to do with her. I contacted my local homeless centre and they told me the girl had serious drink problem and she was in a Simon Community Hospital, but they threw her out because she was drinking again. She came back to see me. Where does this young girl go from here? Nobody seems to want to know anything about this young girl. Neither the HSE nor the mental health services. She's only 18 years of age. She slept for 3 nights on top of a new Halliday Mills apartment block in Key Street in Dock. The system does not work. Addiction complex where are psychological, social or biological elements to it. It must be acknowledged that people who use drugs are not homogeneous groups. Their needs can be varied, multifaceted and complex. In this girl's case, the joint commitment of the Department of Housing, local government and the Department of Health is required to address her needs. We need to work together by considering individual needs. By ensuring alignment across strategies, this ensures a holistic whole of government approach to address the varying and different needs of the individual. Policy and strategy needs to reflect the same aim, have joint commitment and complement each other rather than duplicate issues. It is expected that the Citizens' Assembly will commence in April and conclude its work by the end of the year. Through its contribution, research and the lived experience of its participants, I believe we can succeed in combating and prevailing use of drugs. Minister, just to finish off, Minister, that's a serious situation we have in Dundalk there at the moment. Is no matter where she goes, all these doors keep knocking at her. Like we've got some fantastic services, and to me, they're lip services. So, Minister, I am appealing to you: make these places. You know, if you walk into the local authorities and you have a problem and everything else, like they should either send you to the HSE or even all the department working together. But at the moment, nobody's working together. And I guarantee if you walk through any street, whether it's Dundalk, Dublin, Drogheda, in the moment, these people are they're homeless and all they're doing is crying for help. And I'm a firm believer, for prevention is the best cure. If we can catch these people in an early stage, Minister, we have an opportunity of something to decide. Minister, I know you're new to the job and everything else. I am pleading with you to help these young people, whether they're young, old, or going to school. There is a serious problem there at the moment. And I'm lucky at the moment. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't take drugs at the moment. I'm lucky, but I do see it at first hand in my consistency office. People coming in, families, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters and grannies and grandads, they want help, Minister. And we are pleading with you, Minister, for your department to all work together and help these people. Thank you.
We move now to Deputy O'Dowd.
Well, look, I welcome this debate. I think it's very timely and it's very important as well. I think there's probably a consensus in the House as to the way forward. I think I can reflect, like my colleague Deputy Fitzpatrick, on issues in my own constituency, and I suppose what brought not just Drogheda, where I live, to national attention, but international notoriety in the context of the murder of Cian Mulready Woods, who was a young person, a child, who was murdered as a result of a drug feud. And I suppose that epitomised how low those people who are involved in criminal gangs in the drug trade, how low they can go. And it was just shocking and appalling murder. And our town was riddled with, and is still riddled with drugs, unfortunately. But at that time we were short a significant investment from the Gardaí. There now has been an increase in the numbers of the Gardaí dealing with the drug trade in Drogheda. It's increased by over 47 Gardaí. 18 of those, I think, are community Gardaí. There's been a significant response to that murder, and it is very successful and very helpful in that respect. The debate of the actual Citizens' Assembly must encompass listening to the real witnesses who deal with criminality on a day-to-day basis, with the Gardaí, and could I suggest the name of former Chief Superintendent Christy Mangan, who fought for all his life, but particularly in his latter years in Drogheda, he's retired now, these drug gangs, and he's put most of them behind bars. That is what needed to happen. That is what happened. You need a tough hand given to the Gardaí to ensure these criminals are put away. On the other side, you have in Drogheda the Red Door, which deals with drug issues on the ground. And there's a lady there called Louise O'Mahony, who's the executive there, who runs outreach services to those who are suffering from drug abuse, people who are outside, indeed, of society. And it works day and night to ensure that they are dealt with and that the support services are there for them. And in the middle, you have the Health Services Executive. I think I could call them the health secrets executives, because I have here a copy of a final report or a review of addiction services in Louth and Meath, published in June 2021. One would have thought when you asked the Minister for a copy of it, you would get it. Well, I didn't. I had to go to Freedom of Information request to find out the dysfunctionality in the HSE services in my region, in Louth and Meath particularly. And the silo operations where there was a refusal to integrate and work with community services. Now, the Health Services Executive are dealing with that now, and they have this report deals with the changes they are making. But documents like this should not be hidden from public view. They should be put out there in the public domain where people can get them, and where TDs or anybody else wants them, they can read what exactly is going on. What is the HSE doing? What are the pluses and minuses? What is the community service like? And if it's bad, it's bad. Well, let's get it out there and deal with it. We shouldn't be hiding these facts. But the other fact I want to make, and I know I've very short time, I was hoping my colleague wouldn't come in, so I get the other 4 minutes, is the Drogheda Implementation Report, which is the Gearan report, which deals with the awful murder of Cian Mulready Woods, but how the community is dealing with it. And I have to say that the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, has done a fantastic job and is significantly funding the communities that suffer most from drug abuse in my town. They work with policing and drugs, family supports, children, young people in education, also the creation of employment and jobs and business and enterprise, and also not forgetting community development, arts, culture and sport. I don't have enough time to say what I want to say here. That's one of the problems, guys, here when you're a backbencher. The Minister is excellent. She has her 20 minutes. I'm looking to get my 4. I'd like to have more time to talk on this. And I think the debate, we should have an interim report from the actual Assembly. We should be able to make our own input into it. I know I'm going over your time, James. I know you'll forgive me for that. But I just want to say that we need more time to go through how we solve the problem. But I welcome the fact that it's been set up anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll go straight into that time. Thank you, Gerlach, thank you, Deputy O'Dowd and others, and thank you, Minister, and good luck, Minister, in this new role that you've been assigned, and I have every confidence I'm sure you'll make a great success of it. I'm very pleased to see the government moving towards the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly, and at the outset I just want to thank my colleagues cross-party on the Joint Works Committee on Justice, and indeed to my Secretariat, Alan Guyden and his team, and indeed to all the stakeholders that came into us. And we set out almost a year ago to have hearings on this subject, and we selected it because we felt it was an area of increasing, I suppose, public concern, public policy concern and concern amongst the general public, as an area where perhaps public policy was misguided or at least in need of an update. And in fact, our approach, as it is on any topic that we examine, was to invite stakeholders from every side of the House and every side of the policy spectrum to present to us. And one of the first findings that we made were the advocates in favour of modernising the approach, whether that's decriminalising, legalising, a public health framework or some combination of above, greatly outnumbered any advocates that wish to remain with the current model and with the current system. I'd almost say we had to go looking for people to advocate on behalf of the status quo. I thank those that did, and they did so very well and with great professional integrity and experience. But I think it's fair to say, and the report bears out, that that view was in the minority. And I think if I can summarise the views, and I hope that the committee report proves a useful context to the Citizens' Assembly, I would recommend that, if at all possible, it be used as an input, something that could be distributed to the members of the Citizens' Assembly when it convenes, because we do have, I think, close to 20 recommendations, all expert-based, all evidence-led, all cross-party consensus achieved through our hearings. So I think that report should feed in. But I think in summary, I could summarise all those recommendations in 3 ways. One, that we should accelerate the process of decriminalisation. That's already in being. We see things like an electric picnic when substances were being tested for the first time last year. We see the medical cannabis programme being advanced and rolled out. And we see things like the Drugs Acts currently differentiate between the level of the quantity of a substance and the type of substance somebody has and the actions that are taken as a result. So accelerate the process that's already underway with decriminalisation. Consider a legalisation framework. And I understand that some are less comfortable with that than others, but I think it's about consistency. I think that any of us can walk out of this house, we can walk 5 minutes away or 2 minutes away, depending on whether we go inside or outside the campus, and purchase another drug, which can do irreparable harm to many communities and to individuals. It's called alcohol. But that's perfectly legal, and from 10:30 in the morning you can buy that in any street corner in Ireland. Other substances that may be available in the opposite street corner have no testing, no regulation, no quality control, no checks and balances, yet are prohibited, often because of an accident of history. So I do think that there's a place to examine that model, a kind of a regulatory model that would test, that would quality control, that would sample and would manage, and in so doing would drive out the criminal gangsterism and profiteering that goes on as part of this, and bring some consistency to that debate. And the third spoke for the wheel would be that we would apply a consistent public health lens to all of these substances, whether it's alcohol, whether it's a soft drug, whether it's a hard drug, inverted commas, all these terms, that we would have an educational-based, proactive stance that is based upon public health policy and a health-led approach, and invest in education and treatment and counselling for those that need it. I think that's a very good balance, I think, to strike. I know I'm going slightly over my time, but I'm trying to make up for last time, the man before me. But I think if those 3 pillars could form part of the building blocks of the Citizens' Assembly, certainly our committee report would have done the state some service, and I wish the Assembly well in its deliberations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy. We move to Deputy
Thank you very much, Minister. First of all, we welcome in the Rural Independent Group the opportunity to speak about the new Citizens' Assembly on Drugs, which has been established by the government. While it is due to start in April and conclude before the end of the year, I would like to argue against its formation and why we think it is a waste of time and money. Firstly, drug use has a significant impact on society, imposing significant health and financial costs. However, involving a group of hand-picked citizens in decision-making on drugs policy is not wholly, in our opinion, appropriate. This process represents a cover for a government that has failed to invest in addiction services and drug education, particularly for those who are less well off. Local community groups, GAA clubs and families are struggling to gain access to these services, so the government could immediately intervene and invest in these services today. Setting up an assembly will do nothing but delay and postpone any governmental action to provide the much-needed supports to local communities that is required. My colleagues and I in the Rural Independent Group fully support a health-led approach to drugs, which focuses on treating drug addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. This approach recognises that drug addiction is a complex medical condition that requires treatment and support rather than punishment. However, in tandem with that, while the criminalisation of drugs is often seen as a solution to the harms of drugs use, it is not necessarily required for a health-led approach to be effective. Decriminalisation may remove criminal penalties for drug use, but it does not necessarily address the underlying health issues that lead to addiction. A health-led approach to drugs can be achieved through a range of strategies such as harm reduction, access to evidence-based treatments, and support services for people who use drugs. These strategies aim to reduce the harms associated with drug use, including overdose and transmission of blood-borne diseases, while addressing the root cause of addiction. I think that's my time now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cahill. I'm glad to get the opportunity to talk about this as well. And I'm opposed to the setting up of a Citizens' Assembly because I believe we are the elected people in here to represent the people out there. And handpicking a group of people like he did in previous Citizens' Assembly is not fair. When you think about it, one of those assemblies, which was very important, didn't include any representative from 11 counties, and Kerry being one of those. So I'm afraid of we setting up an assembly here where there's no representative from a place as expansive as Kerry and that has a drug problem. And I'm greatly worried that this is an orchestrated move to legalise drugs instead of criminalising them, because the story is bad enough as it is. They're in every town and every village in our county, every small town and village. And instead of doing something to help the people that have a problem and that develop mental health issues, we see the aims that's been made of the mental health issues in Kerry, with the South Kerry camps and the North Kerry camps, and I suppose it's all over Tipperary and every other place. But there's no proper psychologist or psychiatrist to deal with the young people that are developing problems, and there's no wonder they resort to drugs to find out something different. But this is totally and absolutely wrong. In France, they set up a citizens' assembly, and before they went halfway in their deliberations, they all walked out of it. And the same UK Brexit Citizens' Assembly was widely criticised for not being representative of the population. And again, I say to you, Minister, we are the elected members in here. We've been elected by the people. If we don't do our job, we'll be found out and told that at the next election, and we'll go before the people in our record. These people that he'll appoint here inside, they can walk into anonymity the minute the Citizen Assembly is finished, and they'll probably come up with some idea that we will, and then the Citizens Assembly will be
will say held accountable regardless of what they come forward with, and that's what the government will follow it in. So I feel it is only a cop-out by the government. Here the people that are elected, you're a minister, the rest of you are ministers, and it is your duty to respond to the issues that are arising out there, and drugs is a big problem out there today, but to let it up to Citizens' Assembly, it is totally and absolutely wrong. It is too costly, and it is not it won't be properly representative of the people that are affected, and I'm calling to forget about it and deal with the issue yourselves if you're government enough to do that, and if you're not, pull out and let it to someone else.
Deputy. Shared with Joan Collins.
I'd like to welcome the formation of the Citizens' Assembly on Drug Use. Thanks. I'd like to welcome the formation of the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs Use. I've signed a co-signer of the amendments put forward by Deputy Holly Cairns and myself, and supported by Senator Lynn Ruane. Ireland's drug policy has never achieved what it set out to achieve. There are thousands of convictions each year, the majority of which are around personal use. Young people face the brunt of this, and it sees thousands criminalised in their youth and facing serious and permanent obstacles in their futures. There's never been any benefit to criminalising children or young people. I'm a member of the Canal Community's local drugs and alcohol task force. For decades, community-led organisations working around drug use have known that it's a rehabilitative and health-led approach that makes real differences in the lives of those affected by drug use and addiction. The current drug policies are a significant block to the hard work of many who are working in health services and in their communities. It is not a coincidence that those who work close to the ground, projects like and organisations like Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign, the Anna Liffey Project and Youth Workers Against Prohibition in Ireland are at the forefront of calling for decriminalisation or legalisation of drugs use. People on the ground know that the first step to move our drug policy to a health and rehabilitation-led approach is to remove the punitive approach in our legal system. I support the amendments brought forward. As much as I welcome the Citizens' Assembly, this motion is far too tilted towards the status quo when it's time for a debate on real change in this matter. The consensus on a health-led approach is there. There's no need to put any qualifications on this. I support the call to include a broader range of research, perspectives and advocacy groups to the Assembly. There is a clear consensus on a health-led approach, both from the recent Oireachtas Committee and from advocacy and community groups. This should be at the centre of the Assembly's considerations. I support the call for this to be a consideration on the impact of criminalisation, not just to be a consideration on the impact of drug use. There needs to be an understanding of how the current policy itself has worsened the lives of many in communities affected by addiction. I support the call to promote greater public awareness and understanding. We've had decades of punitive and criminalising approach to drugs use, and this has failed, but has a hangover effect on how the public see drug use and addiction. We need to end the stigma and marginalisation. I support the call for a harm reduction model with a greater range and diversity of supports. How much money has been wasted on convictions and locking up people? These resources need to be put back into services and communities in a way that starts to reverse the harm caused by current policy. Finally, I would like to say that issues around drugs use and addiction are the symptom, not the cause of issues affecting our communities. And while this Assembly is a welcome move, you cannot get rid of the problems around drugs use without getting rid of the deep poverty, neglect and inequality that has plagued many communities for decades. We need proper support and resources around addiction, but this needs to be part of a wider reaction to poverty and inequality. I support the motion. I'd ask the Minister to comment on Deputy Gould's and Deputy Cairns and myself's amendments put into the motion. Thank you.
Gurmagad Akihirlock and Gurmagad to Deputy Collins for sharing her time so I could speak on this very important motion. The fact that we are here today and this Citizens' Assembly, with this motion of it being established, we are a year behind schedule already. There has been a number of delays, and I would just like to state on the record that I hope that no further delays will be seen. We did have your predecessor, Minister Feehan, say that all of the relevant background work was being put in place in order to facilitate the establishment of this assembly as soon as possible of this year. In my short time, I do want to speak about criminalising the drug user and state that it has not worked. It's not grounded in evidence or respect for human dignity. And why are we here having to talk about the need for a citizens' assembly? And that is because of the stigma, the shame and the fear that is associated in conversations, in debates around the use of drugs and those that are in need. Over 30 countries have decriminalised drug possession for personal use, and here we are only now talking about the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly. I just hope that by the time the recommendations are implemented by this House, that those very people who have needed these structural and policy changes aren't bitter by the weight that they have had to endure while this government, while this House takes action for those who do not have voices. And I'm so happy that at least some people will get to have their say, because until policymakers have the ear of the victims, of those that are harmed by these policies that have been implemented by this House, you know, we will not see the changes that are needed.
Thank you, Deputy. We'll move now back to the Minister.
Here, look, and I'd like to first of all thank members for your thoughtful and constructive statements in support of the motion before the House today. And it's clear from the statements over the last hour or so that there's widespread support here in Dáil Éireann for a Citizens' Assembly on drugs use. And there's also a clear sense of the urgency of this task. As I said in my opening remarks, this country has seen too much pain and suffering caused by drugs use. Too many families have lost loved ones through overdose. Too many lives have been ruined by addiction. Too many communities have been living in fear of the criminal gangs that supply drugs in towns and villages across our country. As the debate here today has once again demonstrated, the challenges arising from drug use are complex and multifaceted. And while we know there are no easy answers, there is a clear sense in this House and beyond that the time has come for bold action and new solutions. This is why the decision to establish a Citizens' Assembly to look at the issues is so timely. Citizens' Assemblies serve to enhance the quality of Ireland's democratic system. Previous assemblies have shown that members of the general public have an important contribution to make to addressing complex societal challenges, and I expect that the Citizens' Assembly on drugs use will be no different in this regard. In your statements here today, deputies have identified a range of priorities that they think the Citizens' Assembly on drugs use should address. A number of motions have been tabled that seek to nuance the terms of reference or explicitly itemise various things that deputies believe the Citizens' Assembly should look at. And I fully appreciate the intent behind these proposed amendments. Every deputy who has spoken today has a keen interest in ensuring that the Citizens' Assembly does not overlook or neglect important issues. All parties here are looking for the same outcome, which is a comprehensive, careful and considered process where the Citizens' Assembly looks at all issues mentioned by the deputies here today. And experience shows us not to be overly prescriptive or too detailed in the terms of reference. We need to trust the process and the members of the Citizens' Assembly. Let us recall that Ireland's Citizens' Assembly model is regarded internationally as a leading exemplar of deliberative democracy in action. Citizens' Assemblies have become a valuable part of Ireland's democratic system. Recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly can have a considerable influence on changes to policy, legislation and even the Constitution. They also have a significant role in informing the wider public debate on important topics. Previous assemblies have made recommendations on topics such as marriage equality, repeal of the 8th Amendment, gender equality, climate change and biodiversity. We must continue to learn from experience and build on what has worked successfully in the past. This principle applies in particular to the framing of the terms of reference. We know from past experience that overly detailed terms of reference can inadvertently inhibit the autonomy, discretion and the flexibility for the Citizens' Assembly to define and to organise its work programme as it deems appropriate. Past experience with Citizens' Assemblies have proven time and again that the Oireachtas can trust and indeed must trust both the process and the members of the Assembly. The importance of the voice of young people was raised here today, and I want to ensure and reassure you that the voice of young people is heard at the Citizens' Assembly. And to this end, I've initiated a consultation with young people through Corlin and Nanogue and youth drug projects across the country, which will be presented to the Citizens' Assembly for its consideration. Also, regarding the selection of the Citizens' Assembly, there is now a new and improved method for randomly selecting members. People are not handpicked. There is no guarantee that every county will have a person on the Citizens' Assembly, but there is a guarantee that the final 99 members will correspond with the population profile by region, age group and gender. I am satisfied that the terms of reference as set out in the motion gives the Citizens' Assembly the scope and the flexibility it needs to consider all relevant matters relating to drug use, and this includes each and every issue that members have raised and emphasised here today. The Citizens' Assembly Secretariat will be fully appraised of the debate that has taken place here today, and will be cognisant of the concerns and the priorities that you've all highlighted. Ultimately, it will be up to the members of the Citizens' Assembly to determine their own work programme, and once we are clear that the terms of reference are sufficiently well defined to allow for the Assembly to examine the issues, then we need to step back, respect the independence of the process and allow the members the space and the freedom to get on with the task in hand. And in due course, the Assembly will report back to the Oireachtas, at which point the appropriate committees will have the opportunity to consider and debate and respond to the report and its recommendations. And meanwhile, I'm pleased to confirm that the Assembly will be up and running in a few short weeks. Recruitment of members will begin in the coming days, and the first meeting of the Assembly will take place in mid-April. All going according to schedule, the Assembly is due to report back to the Oireachtas by the end of the year. And Cathaoirleach, I'd like to finish by wishing the Citizens' Assembly every success in their work, and I look forward to seeing the outcome of their deliberations in due course. Thank you.
Minister. That concludes that debate. So what I'll do now, I'll put the amendment number 1 in the name of Deputy Gould as follows, that the amendment be made. Deputies who are in favour say Tá. Deputies who are against say Neil. So in my opinion the question is carried. Vote all. Okay. So the division is postponed until the weekly timed divisions tomorrow evening. So that concludes. Oh, sorry, just in relation to amendment number 2. Is number 2 being pressed?
Sorry, amendment 1 has to be disposed of by the vote tomorrow before amendment 2.
Okay. Amendment 1 will be disposed of tomorrow during weekly divisions, and then we'll proceed to amendment number 2. Okay. So they dispose of amendment 1 first. Okay. So that concludes today's debate. So now I'll just read out a short note in relation to a select committee. The Select Committee on Justice has completed its consideration of the Criminal Justice, Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hatred Offences Bill 2022 and has made amendments.
So there we go, guys. That was the introduction of the motion on the Citizens' Assembly to the Dáil. I suppose you've seen it there yourselves. There was a lot of prejudice there, I suppose, against illicit drug users. There was only one mention of non-problematic drug use. There was zero mention of the harms caused to the individual by drug prohibition either. You know, you would have thought that would have made up a bit of a conversation there. There was very little towards that at all. But look, overall, it's great that the conversation has happened. There was a lot of support there for change. There was a lot of support there for decriminalising the drug user, and even a good bit of support there as well for a regulated drug supply. So it's promising, certainly promising. Let's see what happens now with the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly. The minister there said that it's going to be happening around the middle of April, so possibly maybe 420. Hey, but yeah, middle of April there, they're looking at starting this off. It'll take a couple of months for it to go through. and then towards the end of the year they'll file a report on which the government then hopefully will actually listen to some of the recommendations off of. There was our publication there by the Justice Committee only just a couple of weeks ago, with some amazing recommendations, 22 of them there, and there's been nada, zilch done about them. Like, there hasn't been a single shred of conversation had in the Dáil, as far as I'm aware, on the recommendations of that Justice Committee. And those recommendations are fucking amazing recommendations, 22 very good recommendations made, and instead of listening to that Justice Committee, which we spent a lot of money on, we're now going to form the Citizens Assembly, which we're going to spend even more money on, and we're going to come up with some similar recommendations, I would hope. But those 22 recommendations by the Justice Committee at that time were very good recommendations. James Lawless speaking there during the introduction of the motion on the Citizens Assembly, also bringing up the need to legalise and regulate the supply of drugs. So very welcome to see that conversation being had in the Dáil anyway. Healy Ray's contribution there, so I'm not really surprised, but it's kind of funny that those guys, being big lovers of the drink, are anti-drug. They're not seeing the irony in that, that drinking drugs, it's like, drink isn't a drug, it's separate to them, isn't it? And maybe for the Kerry people, nothing against Kerry people, but you are the butt of jokes here in Cork, and when you have two clowns like that speaking up, then you can't blame us for making fun of the Kerry people. Again, I've lots of good friends out there who are Kerry people, okay? But yeah, so hopefully everybody enjoyed that Dáil session there. If you could ever enjoy something from the Dáil. But as I said, it's definitely very welcome to see that conversation being had anyway. So I'm going to love you and leave you guys. I'll be back with some 420 news there later on in the week. Just going to head off, do a little bit of swimming there now for the rest of the evening with Alexis and Elijah. Meant to do it a bit earlier today, but the public swimming times were closed. So it's 6 o'clock on. So everybody else out there, have a nice evening. We'll catch you all on the other side. Nice one, everybody, as well in the hot box. See Barry Fields, Rashers, CG, Stephen Cav, Irish Canna Clinic, Mary Hinge, and many more out there as well, guys. Nice one, everybody, for your contributions. I was pretty much sitting there in the hot box throughout the most of it anyway, with you listening in and commenting away as well. But I really appreciate all your contributions there, guys. Thanks very much, and until next time, stay safe out there, guys. Bye.